Now, when you think of Brazil, you probably don't think of Germans and Italians, which is fair enough, but there is some interesting linguistic things going on in southern Brazil that I'm bored, so I'm going to tell you about right now. For a bit of context, going back to the 1820s-ish, you had a lot of European immigration to the Americas. This was part of just a general mass movement of people to get away from famines, from those nasty inbred autocracies of the kingdoms of Europe. And this included the newly established Empire of Brazil, which presided over a very large amount of land. So you've got all of these European immigrants escaping all these problems to the Americas for a new, better life. So these immigrants start setting up communities, towns, settlements and farms in southern Brazil. And obviously they speak their own language to each other, because that's kind of how these immigration centres worked, was it would attract other people from these groups. So you had all this very diverse group of people kind of coalescing into little communities and speaking their own languages. This was not unusual for the Americas at the time, but as I'm sure many of you will know, you don't often see in many American countries these people still speaking these languages. In America, there are very few people who still speak German, despite the large amount of German settlers that moved there in this time period. But in Brazil, these people carried on speaking their languages, and this is due to many factors that I will explain to you throughout the course of my rambling. So enjoy. So I think it's natural to start with the earliest immigrants and then move to some of the newer ones over the course of the 19th century. So a lot of the earliest immigrants were from Germany. Specifically, East Pomerania was a big hotspot of kind of people who moved to Brazil and set up these communities. There are some towns in southern Brazil, like Blumenau. I'm sure I'll put some pictures up on the screen, but these communities kind of set up by these Eastern Pomeranian communities were very strongly German. This is interesting because these are kind of pre-unification dialects, so they're quite different from modern-day standard German. But because of their separation from the mainland, these kind of differences stayed. They didn't coalesce into the modern language that we know today, which is why this is so interesting, is because you now today have these linguistic groups that speak a language that isn't really around where they came from anymore. So they're this like surviving kind of remnant of this old dialect, this old linguistic community that doesn't even exist back home, which I think is fascinating. But as these settlements developed, you had, at least in the more urban centres like Blumenau, you had this weird merging of the local Portuguese kind of main spoken language of Brazil with these dialects. So there's quite a large linguistic group of people who speak Hundrick, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is like a kind of, it's a mix of old German dialects and Portuguese, which kind of forms this unique language, which is a hybrid of all these different dialects and Portuguese, which makes it very distinct from modern German. This is spoken by about 3 million people, give or take. There's not really any accurate estimates that are available, but that's quite a significant amount of people, especially for such a kind of concentrated area in the south. So you've got all these kind of towns and areas which are very German feeling when you go to them. These communities stayed strong and rather insular until about the 1930s, when it was really damaged by the then leader of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas. I don't know how to pronounce his name properly. I'm sure I butchered that. His nationalization campaign in the late 30s and early 40s really cracked down on these immigrant communities of Italians and Germans and even Japanese, Polish and Russians. And it attempted to kind of ban these languages in an attempt to unify the country in speaking Portuguese, there was a large decrease in speakers of the languages as it was banned in public for the most part. This started these communities on a kind of downward turn, as for a good number of years, them communicating in their language was banned in public spaces. They couldn't publish their own literature, they couldn't speak it in schools, they had to learn Portuguese, and this really sped up the rate at which these immigrants were slowly kind of integrating into the greater Brazilian populace, which was the goal of the campaign. In more recent years, 2015, there was kind of a lot of bilingual initiatives to kind of keep these languages alive as part of the heritage of Brazil, as Brazil is a very multicultural state and there's a lot of pride in that. In the rural centres, you often find not even Hunsrück, you find East Pomeranian speakers, you find Low German speakers who don't even speak the kind of, I guess you call it a Creole, I'm not sure if I'm using that word correctly, and they just speak purely the dialects that they came here with. So you've got a few towns in southern Brazil which a majority East Pomeranian, who speak East Pomeranian and who are probably the last towns which properly speak it. This is kind of decreasing with time, as even the most rural kind of communities are getting linked up with the internet, with more infrastructure to these urban centres, and they're getting more exposed to Portuguese and mainstream Brazilian culture. These linguistic communities are slowly kind of fading away a little bit. Now, the other group of people that I want to talk about are the Italians. They came a bit later on in the kind of timeline of immigration to Brazil, roughly arriving in the 1870s through to the 1910s. These people came from mostly northern Italy, so you've got your Lombards, you've got people from Trentino, you've got people from Venice and Veneto, and these people all arrived in southern Brazil, kind of in similar areas to the German immigrants did. And they also set up their communities. But a lot of them, due to the aspect of Portuguese being a fellow Romance language and being easier to learn for Italians, a lot less of them kept their local dialects, but a lot of them did. And this led to the preserving of a lot of these old Italian dialects, especially Venetian, which kind of evolved over time into this Portuguese-Venetian crossover language called Italian. They just dropped the I of Italian, they just called it Italian. Why? I don't know. Very creative. But this language is quite popular even today in Brazil, and there are many speakers. There isn't any strict numbers around how many there are. I've seen estimates go up to about 1.5 million-ish. Is that right? Did I read that? Let's check this. Hold up. There's estimates that go up to about 2 million. There are about 4 million Italian descendants in Brazil today, but obviously a lot of them won't be speaking Italian. But it's a non-zero number. It's a bit lower than Hunsrück, but it's still significant. And this language is very unique because not only is it, like Hunsrück, based off of old regional dialects, but it's a lot more integrated with Portuguese, with loan words from newer inventions and concepts which weren't around when these people arrived. Now, these are almost like time capsules, in my opinion, of these old dialects which aren't spoken in these areas much anymore. And I think that's fascinating that they only exist really in Brazil and South America more generally, which is such a weird phenomenon that I don't see many people talking about. These kind of linguistic groups which just kind of migrated, and the home populations kind of got subsumed into their national unified languages. Brazil is very unique in this aspect because it's kept these languages, whereas in America you'd see a lot of German immigration, but very few German speakers today. In Brazil you've got millions of people who speak these old remnants of these dialects, which is fascinating. And I think the reason for this is kind of the rurality of these communities and the lower level of development in Brazil at the time. So in America, you had, especially in, let's take Wisconsin. Wisconsin also had a large portion of East Pomeranians come over around the same time. And for a long time, these people did still speak German, but they started learning English a lot quicker than the Brazilian immigrants started learning Portuguese. And I think this is due to a few reasons. Obviously, English is easier to learn for Germans, as Portuguese is easier to learn for Italians. But also, America kind of had a higher level of infrastructure which linked these people to these urban centres, and it became less and less ideal to speak these languages instead of the metropolitan language of English. And in Brazil, you have, on the contrary, these rural communities where you don't really need to go out and speak with the Portuguese speakers. You're very isolated. Now, obviously, now this is going away a little bit as Brazil gets more connected, as the internet comes into play and Brazil's more and more developed. These people are finding that it's a lot more useful to know Portuguese, hence why there's a kind of decrease in the number of people who only speak these languages. Pretty much everyone who speaks these languages also speaks Portuguese, due to just practicality reasons. Whilst the co-official status that it now holds within these states is very important in keeping this heritage alive, I think whilst it will prevent total extinction, as it's kind of happened in America, I think it will still kind of go the same way, where it will be less prominent as time goes on. I think the linguistic richness of southern Brazil is fascinating, and I really hope that these co-official statuses kind of keep this alive, because it's such a fascinating little pocket of linguistics which is quite unique to South America, I think, and it's very important to keep that alive. I just think that with modern times it's going to become less and less practical for these people to purely speak their language, and that's completely fair. I guess time will only tell what happens to these communities, but it's just a very interesting and niche topic that I wanted to talk about because I've known it for a long time and nobody is ever wanting to talk about it, so I just thought I'd make a video about it, because why not, you know?